It is 11:01. I'm a minute late. We'll see how this goes with Facebook here. I will get started in just a second. Give y'all a couple minutes, or give whomever would like to join a couple minutes to find the broadcast. But I think we are live. We're going. All right. Cool. I think we're good. As usual, if there are any technical difficulties, stutteriness in the video feed or the audio levels or whatever the case may be, it would be helpful if you would just drop that in the comments. Um, I don't often go to the comments during the broadcast, but after the fact, it's helpful for me to be able to go back and see when the video is having trouble, and hopefully I can fix it for next time. All right, everybody. It is 11:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I actually don't have very much studio time today, and I'm kind of anxious to get over. I've got some paintings I've been working on that took a turn for the better yesterday, so I'm kind of anxious to get back to them. If I remember, I'm not good at remembering to post these things to social media, but if I remember, I'll post them to my Instagram account, or post in work in progress pictures to my Instagram account. That's Trent Reynolds Art, I believe, is my Instagram account name. A couple things that I wanted to mention before I get started on the critique today. One is that I have now posted a resin techniques class. This is a series of 5 videos that come from the 5-week course that I taught earlier this year about resin, using epoxy resin in artwork. So as I mentioned in that class, or in advertisements for that class a while back, we often think of epoxy resin as just a shiny top coat, as kind of a finishing layer that makes everything evenly smooth. And over the past several years that I've been using it, I've just found that that's not the case. That it can be so much more, and it's a really amazing material that has a lot of potential for all different kinds of artwork. Things that you would never suspect were resin are resin. That's kind of a stupid thing to say, but there's a lot of different ways that it can be used and achieve results that are just not possible any other way. Anyway, so these 5 videos give you a pretty thorough and densely packed start. Different ideas on how you can manipulate resin, how you can control it, different layering techniques, different levels of transparency, different kinds of finishes. You can do things to the resin to make it less shiny. Ways that you can create molds, ways you can use it with collage, with acrylic paint. It's just a very, very cool material. So that course, that five video class called Resin Techniques, is now available on my website. So that is Dabbleon, Dabbleon.com. And if you go to, I think it says up at the top, classes. I'm forgetting now. I change my website around quite often. At any rate, you should be able to find it fairly easily. The Resin Techniques class. For this first week that it will be posted, I think up through next Monday or Tuesday, it's going to be half off. So $25, not very much. It's a great value. There's a lot of information in there, and I hope you check it out, because it's a medium that's really started to, well, had a big impact on my work for the past 3 years or so. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, speaking of resin, my in-person resin workshop is happening this weekend, starting Friday. So it's Friday evening, 5 to 8, and then there's 2 sessions on Saturday morning and afternoon. So 3 sessions workshop. basically a evening and then a morning and an afternoon. So it's enough time for us to dig into resin and learn a lot and experiment a lot. There are open spots still available. So if you would like to join me for a in-person resin workshop, I'm also including that 5-video series class as part of registration for the workshop. So if you're in the Santa Monica area and you have time this weekend, starting on Friday, so that's June 11th and 12th, I hope you will join me at my studio in Santa Monica. That's Friday evening, and then 2 sessions, morning and afternoon, on Saturday. So that is available, and if you register for that, you get the 5 classes for free. And I think that's all the announcements I have. You might notice that I am now in heaven. Once again, I have changed my background, and this, I'm sure, will be a perpetual quest to find a background that I like. This white background, little too sparse, little too Apple computer advertisement campaign. I don't know. But I'm looking at this compared to my previous videos, and my previous videos just feel so dark. Anyway, you'll have to let me know if you like the white background better than the plain canvas background, better than the abstract shapes in the background. I'd be curious if there are any opinions on the subject out there. So today I got an image of a painting that gives us a chance to talk about some kind of cool things. So I hope this is as interesting to you as I find it. But it gives us a chance to talk a little bit about photo effects, how photography and the use, our exposure to photographic processes, whether that be in still photography or in video, film, how that has influenced, how it's affected our perception and our visual vocabulary in kind of contemporary culture. So I thought we have some opportunity to discuss that here. Let me switch over here. And I forgot to turn on, let's see, that. Let me go over here real quick, and I'm going to make myself square in the top, right down there. Okay, there we go. That's a little bit easy to keep track of myself. All right, so I have this painting which was sent to me, and it is, first of all, it's a cool painting. It's watercolor, I believe. I hope I'm getting that right. And it is based on this photograph right here, which is also a cool photograph. All right, so here's the painting and here's the photograph. Before I get into kind of talking about some of these photographic effects, I wanted to just quickly address some compositional things that I thought might be helpful. One is, well, I think the placement, it's the red flag, and I feel like I cannot control the compulsion to mention when something is centered. So it is aligned with both the horizontal and vertical axis pretty closely. So what I mean by that is, and I'll try not to go overboard on this, but we've got this line right here that's pretty close to the center axis, and then this line right here that's pretty close to the horizontal axis. And really these dominant shapes in your composition, the post coming in from the bottom and then the ellipse of the bowl, are both fairly centrally located and really emphasizing the center of that of the frame, of the composition window, the format. It's not that big a deal, and in this case, it doesn't bother me at all. I think it's fine. There are other ways that you could compose the same subject matter, that would be just give more energy and give more opportunity for us to cycle through the image and get us out into the corners of the composition. What the decision to put this so central in the composition in the window is going to lock us in on the center. And to a certain degree, you've kind of communicated that you're okay with that by kind of blurring everything else out in the background. So the negative space is obviously not meant to grab our attention or doesn't really invite us into the background, which is okay too. These are just decisions that are going to be made depending on what your priorities are and what you want the image to accomplish. So in this case, you've got some really nice dynamic energy, both with the stream of water and then these droplets kind of splashing off. I think there's opportunity there perhaps to emphasize that movement and to engage that movement, maybe providing us a visual pathway to follow that movement into the background with just how you're dividing the background shape. So I wanted to give you an idea of what that might look like. The other thing that I noticed is just that there's not a lot of contrast between, or rather maybe a better way of saying it would be that the stream of water, which seems like an important part of the composition, seems like a primary, what you want us to focus on, a focal point, right, or point of interest, gets lost as it comes up here in arches. I guess I'd like a little bit of negative space above the water. It kind of goes out of frame, which might or might have not been originally planned, but a little bit more space, just because I feel like that this arch of water is kind of the subject of the image. But besides that, the arch of water we lose that because there's not as much contrast between the arch of water and the background, right? And that's actually also happening here in the original image, where there's not a whole lot of contrast between the values in this water and the background values, right? Water's transparent, so we're going to see whatever's behind it, so that's part of it. But also, these background values are light, so these specular highlights, these really light white highlights on the water, also there's just not very much contrast between those and the background. So really there's not a whole lot that sets apart this stream of water. So this is the suggestion that I wanted to make. First, I'm going to load, before I started here, I made a selection. I selected the background. So you'll see that these dotted lines that you can see right now, that is, I just selected the background of the image. It's a mask. And I'm going to turn off those dotted lines, that selection, but it's still there. You just can't see it. And this is so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the hue saturation filter here. And I'm not going to change the lightness and darkness, right? Changing that would make that water really stand out. But I don't think you have to do that. And you're following the image. So, maybe you want to stick as closely to the image as possible, or for whatever reason. I don't think you have to change the value here. But what you might want to consider is changing the hue. So you have a lot of these neutral blues in the stream of water, and also in the bowl and the post. If you were to instead, you kind of have these orangey colors here. It looks like a reflected light in the bowl right here at the base of the water fountain, and that might just be grime or something that's on this. But it also, because it's on a reflective surface, feels like it might be reflecting something in the background. So even just for that reason, maybe having some of these warmer neutral colors in the background, kind of a orangey brown, might help. But now by having this, now we have color contrast, right? So we have a complementary, you got orange next to blue, those are complementary colors. So we haven't changed the value, how light or dark the background is. Instead, we're creating contrast with this stream by putting a complementary color right next to it, right? So even though it's a very neutral orange, right? Brown is neutral orange. It is a complement, and that's going to help separate the stream of water a little bit better to make it more visible. Again, the attempt here is to try to make this so it stands out a little bit more from the background. So that's another way to create contrast. You don't have to change the light and darkness. Just putting a little bit of complement in the background would also do the trick. Now, what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to take the eraser here. And what I could do is, let's see, I've got that kind of arc of water. What if I don't know, I would probably just experiment. Maybe dividing the negative space up. You've got it kind of gets darker at the bottom, so you've got that dividing the space up. But what if I had kind of a diagonal from top right to bottom left? So what I'm doing here is I'm just erasing through this second layer, right? So to reveal the original image that's below it, for those of you that care what's going on in Photoshop. But now I've activated that diagonal. I don't know if that's the right way to go, but that helps create a more dynamic energy in the negative space. It kind of goes against what's this kind of arc that's happening. Maybe I could also try. Let's see. Let me get back to this. What if I instead I emphasized this, you know, some kind of arc in the background, like a circle. Yeah, a circle. And maybe that arc, let me see if I can, oops. So maybe this arc of that circle, that soft division between the browns and the blue, maybe that helps kind of mirror or accentuate the arc of the water. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not satisfied that these are either of those are the best ideas. But the point here is that there are ways that you could use just a simple gradation to accentuate the movement that's being established here by the primary area of interest, I think, which is this water. And again, you kind of do that. You do that a little bit of separation as it gradates into something darker at the bottom, but I think maybe a little bit more could be done to create more dynamic energy in the background. All right, so that would be my suggestion. So we have this complement, a fairly neutral complement in the background to create more contrast with the stream of water, to make the stream of water stand out more, right? That's the whole purpose behind what I did. And then also maybe using that gradation from the warm neutrals into the cool blues, using that line as a way to start dividing up the background in the negative space in a way that creates more dynamic energy, these kind of circular or diagonal types of divisions. All right, so I'm going to leave that there. Maybe, I don't know, I'm going to go back, get back a little bit to the diagonal. I kind of like the diagonal better than the circle. Anyway, maybe I'll leave that there. Okay, leaving that alone for the moment. And in fact, I'm just going to turn that off, and I'm going to duplicate the background again. Let's see, duplicate the background so I don't mess it up. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about photo effects, right? So visual information that's a byproduct of lenses, of photographic processes, right? So let's look at this photograph right here. Photography is just capturing visual information that or light that is coming through a lens, right? And lens distorts or interacts with light in different ways. It has a focal, all lenses have a focal length, right? So some lenses have what's called a shallow depth of field, meaning that the distance from the lens has to be a certain distance, and it doesn't take very much change in that distance for things to start going out of focus, right? So the distance from the lens, right now my face is in focus, for example. I'm looking at the camera. That's why I'm looking like a, I don't know, deer in the headlight. I'm going to move the camera back over to the front camera. Okay, so right now my face is in focus because I'm the correct distance from the camera lens, right? If I go toward the lens, I'm going out of that range where the lens is in focus. Anything out of that range, either toward the lens or away from the lens, is going to look out of focus, right? That's called the depth of field. What amount of space or distance from the camera is going to remain in focus. So let me get this, if I get this remote, this is my light remote, really close to the camera, you can see all the buttons are fuzzy and my face is still in focus, right? Because now this object is outside of the focal range, or the depth of field, right? Or the range of focus. I'm getting my terminology mixed up. Believe it or not, I used to teach photography. So I should know these terms, but they're not fresh in my mind. Okay, so it's out of focus, and then I bring it back, and now it's back in focus. Now, if I were to extend this an equal distance back, and let's see if I can't tell right now. So now it's also out of focus because, again, it's out of that range, that depth of field. And some lenses have a shallower depth of field, meaning it can't get outside of that range. There's not very much distance till it starts to go out of focus. And some lenses have deep depth of field, meaning that everything stays in focus, right? Even the background will look in focus. So looking at this image, let's go back to this image. You can see that in the background, and there's a lot of other reasons that the background could be out of focus. It's not just depth of field, it's also proximity to the camera. If the background's, well, I guess that's kind of depth of field, but there's a lot of different things that can accentuate depth of field effects. But you can see that the background, look at this image, this information down at the bottom of the image, all of that information is very soft. It's very blurry, right? And that is blurriness. That's a product of how that lens is rendering light on the camera sensor, right? Depth of field. That's a photographic effect. Different lenses have different, either deeper or shallower depths of field, causing different amounts of blurriness. All right. So why I'm bringing this up is that effect, that photo effect, that's a byproduct of just how lenses work and how cameras work, more and more is affecting how we perceive space. Not only that, but as artists, we can now use that effect, that things getting blurry means space, means things are further away. We can use that to manipulate, or to, not manipulate, but to create the illusion or accentuate the illusion of space, right? So when we make some things blurry and something sharp-edged, that implies a spatial relationship, that the blurry things are farther away or closer in relation to the things that are in focus, right? It taps into our this kind of visual relationship that we've become accustomed to, or that we've been trained to perceive because of our exposure to photographic effects. All right, I'm overstating this a little bit, but hopefully you get the idea. Okay, the other effect that I wanted to point out here is motion blur. So this is another byproduct of photographic techniques or photographic processes, right? So when you have a camera, if the camera's shutter opens up, it exposes the sensor or the film, if you're using an old analog camera, exposes the film to light, and then the shutter closes. So the light is no longer hitting the sensor. If the camera shutter is open for a long time and whatever it's pointed at moves at all, it's going to record every stage of that movement, and what that translates to is blurriness. That's called motion blur. That's a different kind of blurriness than depth of field, right? It's the camera trying to record all the different versions of light that it's exposed to as whatever the subject is moves, right? So our eyes see blurriness for the same reason, right? Our optic nerve is getting exposed to light. It can only process that light with a certain quickness, right? But we perceive motion blur as whatever we're looking at is moving, right? So if somebody runs really fast, or a speeding bullet, or whatever, a car, a car. Sorry, I'm going to. Oh, you guys just saw my text threads. Hopefully I didn't expose anything personal there. All right, so motion blur. If things are going in front of our eyes very fast, they will appear blurry. Cameras have the ability to open and shut that shutter very quickly, right? Not all the time, but some cameras have the ability to open and shut quickly and still get enough light to record an image. And that's how we can stop motion, like in this photograph where the water is in focus. But then you can see down here at the bottom that these droplets of water have a blur that is kind of a linear blur. So it's a blur in a direction rather than kind of an even blur, an ambient blur that's happening because of depth of field. And that blur that happens because of movement, because the camera's recording that information as it as it goes across its field of view, that we interpret that as movement, right? So that visual information, that blur that happens in a kind of linear direction, implies or creates the illusion of movement. That's what it communicates to our eyes, to our perception, right? So we have stopped motion, and then we have motion that was faster than the camera shutter could open and shut, right? So it stayed open too long, and these droplets moved while it was open, and we get the motion blur. All right, so these two photo effects, the blurriness of the background because of depth of field, and then the blurriness of the droplets because the camera shutter didn't open and shut fast enough to stop that motion and get a crisp edge. So what I wanted to just suggest here is that let's look at the background of the image. And when we make brush strokes, we are creating little edges sometimes, right? It could be with the texture. It could be the very subtle contrast between different values or just slightly different colors in the background. So here I can see just some little, these edges of brush strokes. And let me show you what happens. Again, I'm going to load that selection. Let's see. Whoops. Select, load selection. Oh, come on. Load selection. And I'm going to load the background selection. And I'm going to turn that off so you can see what I'm doing. And if I go to a blur and Gaussian blur, now look what happens if I put a blur on that background. See, without the blur, it doesn't look like there's a lot of sharp edges back there, right? It looks like it's pretty soft gradation from bottom to top, and certainly not as contrasty and sharp edged as the water fountain. But notice how when I blur it, all of a sudden now it's easier to see that actually there are some sharp edges back there. They're fairly subtle, but they do make a difference, right? So when I make that blurrier, that effect of distance, that shallow depth of field effect, is accentuated, right? And it really makes the water fountain stand out more, pop out more. It makes it feel like it's closer to us right? Also, our eyes can go blurry and in focus, right? So having one part of the image that is much more in focus than something else is also going to do a lot to create, literal focal point, right? But also create area, communicate to the viewer what is of primary importance in our image, right? So there's a lot of different reasons that we could use these visual effects that are a byproduct of photographic processes to our advantage to clarify what our image or our composition is about, right? We can use that blurriness sharpness relationship to just make a more compelling, more create more variety, and just tap into these visual effects that we've become more accustomed to, or that we've been more visually trained to. All right. So again, turning that blurriness on and then back off. And I think the point that I want to make here is that sometimes when the way that we're applying paint creates a texture, and if that texture has sharp edges, even if it's very subtle sharp edges, that might be contradicting that blurriness of depth of field that we're trying to get. And I see this quite often, actually, especially with like acrylic paint, because acrylic paint dries so fast that it's hard not to get some of those really sharp edges. So, for example, somebody might be trying to paint something that has a blurry background and trying to get a nice smooth gradient, but just by nature of acrylic paint drying so fast, they end up getting this texture that contradicts that blurriness effect that they're trying to get. And I think that is probably a little bit of what's happening here, that she had wanted this background to be soft and blurred, but because of perhaps going over and over the paint, the background with many layers of color or many layers of brush strokes, even though it's watercolor, that we're starting to get a little bit of texture, a little bit of sharp edges that contradict that sense of depth of field that we're after. Anyway, this is a long way of, I wanted to explain kind of what's going on, and hopefully I'm not over-explaining. But in that case, the way to remedy that, and something that might help in this case, tap into that sense of depth of field, is rather than basically just not do as many brush strokes, right? So before you do the background, and while you're building up your painting, get a bigger brush, more paint, and address a larger area of that negative space at a time, right? So don't take a little brush and a little bit of paint and then, do this kind of thing. Get a big mop brush, dip it in a lot of paint, and then just go over the whole thing in one swoop, right? Or as few marks as possible, while the water's really wet, so the colors can be mixed really fluidly, right? And you get a lot of just natural blur because of what watercolor does, when things are wet, right? It blends and blurs. So in this case, if this is a big if you wanted to have a blurrier background to tap into that sense of a depth of field that accentuates our sense of space, our perception of space, then more paint, fewer brush strokes, don't fuss as much, make sure that all the colors are wet so they can blur and run. And then once that's dry, leave it alone. Don't go back and start fussing with more brush strokes. If you do, go back with, again, a big brush, water, make sure things are wet, or you're going to start getting those little, even if they're subtle, little points of sharp edges that contradict our sense of that depth of field blur. All right, so enough of that. Along the same lines, I'm going to go pick up this blur tool, and I'm going to undo that blurriness. I could, for example, artificially add depth of field that's not even there, right? So let's say I wanted to make the front lip a little bit blurrier. I don't know if that's as clear on the video feed as it is on my screen. Oh, you know what's happening is that selection is still active. Okay, so I could make that front edge of that bowl blurry. Can you see that? I don't know if that's as visible. But making that front edge blurry is just like when I took this and held it close to the camera, right? That's, again, accentuating this optical effect from cameras, the shallow depth of field effect. You'll notice the post is still in focus because I want this part of the bowl and the water fountain in focus. So there, the post and the water fountain are the same distance from the lens. You know, again, I'm making this up, but to tap into the shallow depth of field, I would want that to be the case. And then maybe even making this back edge of the bowl a little blurry. So again, it's like as if it's out of that depth of field. So what I'm doing is I'm exaggerating the depth of field effect, making the range of distance from the lens even narrower where the subject is in focus. And that's going to make this even tighter, you know, essentially just really locking us in, feeling like the arch of the water is what's in focus and what deserves our attention as a result. But now I've got this contradiction between the blurriness of this and then the not blurriness of the background. So let me do, I'm sorry guys, this is probably a little overboard, but I'm going to do it anyway. So if I go back and I'm going to add a little bit of a blur, let's see, Gaussian blur to the background. Right. So again, as I'm blurring the background and then I'm blurring the front edge of the bowl and the back edge of the bowl, again, to accentuate the sharpness of the water. Okay. I think that's probably enough of my indulgence in explaining photographic effects. The final thing I'll say is that we talked about the depth of field effect, so blurriness because of space. There is also motion blur. So she could have also made these droplets a little bit more blurry in a linear way, right? So that blur is not just going to be evenly treated, it's going to happen along a trajectory, a path. So maybe the back ends of the droplets just a little fuzzy, and that's going to suggest that these droplets are in action, are moving, right? And then the final thing that I will say is that we can use blur artificially that doesn't have anything to do with shallow depth of field effect or with motion blur, and we can just use it as a way to communicate to the viewer that this thing isn't important, right? We're kind of obfuscating, is that the word? Obfuscating part of the image just by making it fuzzy, right? So in this case, I've got a lot of contrast down here in the base of the water fountain, a lot of dark and light. That's grabbing my attention. If I want to obfuscate that without really changing the colors or contrast, if I just blur that area, that's tapping into, again, a visual cue or a visual phenomenon that things that are out of focus aren't what's important, right? You're kind of forcing us, our perception, or our brains you're forcing our brains or suggesting to our brains that this isn't what's in focus. This isn't what you're supposed to be paying attention to, right? You're deciding for us what to focus on, right? You're making the decision for our attention, basically. So even though that doesn't necessarily have to do with accentuating a depth of field effect or a motion blur effect, just blurring something can help to create focus and emphasis. So I think that might not be a bad idea in this case, where you do have that very dominant dark shape down at the bottom. Just making those edges a little softer, not as sharp, doesn't even have to be as dramatic as I'm making it, is going to help de-emphasize that at the bottom without having to really change much in terms of value. or color. All right, so I'm going to go turn this back on. This little bit of warm in the background is, I can create contrast with that stream of water to offset a little bit without changing anything about the value relationship. I can also use that as a way to accentuate how the background or negative space is divided, and accentuate the movement that's in that stream of water. And then I talked a lot about the different visual effects that are a byproduct of different photographic processes that we're exposed to. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. As I was saying in the beginning, I just think it's the reason I spend this much time on it. Not that I have to justify it, but I still want to say it. Is that the technologies that we're exposed to, or the different kind of visual trends, the colors that we see in the magazines that surround us, the kind of plants, the light that exists in our particular part of the world. All of these things train us, right? And train us in terms of how we perceive and interact with the world. So as artists, as we walk around, as we experience the world around us, part of, I don't know if I should say part of our job, or something that will make us a better artist, or expand the tools that we have at our disposal to make compelling imagery, is really learning to see and analyze all those types of visual information, and how they're affecting how we interact with the world, how they're affecting how we perceive. When we understand how that's functioning, how that's working, how that's affecting our perception, we can start including those things into our artwork, right? When we understand it, we can use it, and we can control it, and we can make our visual language, our visual communication, all the more compelling, clear, impactful, all of these things. So I thought it was worthwhile kind of digging a little bit deeper into these photographic effects, and how we are more trained and attuned to them just because we're exposed to them a whole lot more than ever before in the history of our planet, as far as we know, right? So photographic effects, kind of cool. And that's all I got for you today. Hopefully that was helpful. If I didn't say so in the beginning, I think this is a lovely painting. I do like it as it was. I should always say this at the beginning. I like the monochroma. I like that it's all this kind of in these ranges of blue, and then you have little punctuations of complement, in some of these areas in the bull and the reflection. So. And I like the sharpness. I like the stopped motion effect. So it's a cool image as it is alone. It doesn't. I wouldn't fuss with it anymore. The things that I was talking about today are just maybe food for thought for future paintings. But well done. Thanks for sharing this image. Thanks for sharing the painting. It looks fantastic. And as usual with this particular artist, really impressed with the craftsmanship. I think you're a fantastic painter. So, and great with watercolor. Watercolor can be very difficult. One of those, and I shouldn't talk about watercolor because I am not an expert on watercolor by any stretch of the imagination. But something I've noticed over time is that it can be really difficult to get really deep, rich, dark values with watercolor. It's not difficult, but it is often something that a mistake I think people make with watercolors, not including enough paint. And you're doing that here. You're getting those really nice, saturated, deep, dark colors, and so well done. All right, I'm just rambling, so I'm going to cut it off there. Go check out Dabbleon.com for the Resin Techniques class. It's half off this week. If you're interested in learning about epoxy resin and what it might do for your artwork, definitely check that out. And then also, if you're interested in joining me this weekend on Friday, starting on Friday evening, for a resin workshop where we will be digging deeper into what is possible, and then talking about specifically how you could use it in your work, make sure you go and register immediately. quickly. And then also with registration for the workshop, you'll also get that 5-video class for free. So hopefully you can join me on Friday. And if not, I will remind you that if you want me to critique your work, if you're interested in getting my feedback, you can send me images at dabbleon@gmail.com, Dabbleon @gmail.com. And I'm here 11 a.m. Los Angeles time every week. And I will see you next time. I'll check out the comments after I end here. Thanks everybody for participating, for being here, for sending me images and leaving comments and all the things that you do. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will see you all next time.